This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. After experiencing trauma, I went to therapy, and my therapist guided me through a difficult time in my life. They helped me understand what was happening and provided me with tools to cope and find my own strength and resilience. Their experience and compassion were invaluable and enabled me to rebuild my life and move forward. I strongly believe in the power of therapy to help people through difficult times. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. First, you go to their site. You can use my link, betterhelp.com/resilience. You answer a few questions, and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people with struggles just like yours. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/resilience or choose podcast, then Notes on Resilience during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month. Hello, welcome to Notes on Resilience. I'm your host, Manya Chilinsky, and my guest today is Dan Griffin, who is an author, a thought leader, and an expert on men's relationships and masculinity. And we had an amazing conversation about men and trauma and what do we really mean when we're saying the phrase toxic masculinity and how can we help men heal? I had a great time talking with Dan. I think you're going to love this conversation. Hi, Dan. Thanks for being here. I'm so excited to talk with you.
Hi, Manya. It's very, very nice to be here and to speak with you. And I'm looking forward to our conversation wherever it leads.
Yeah. Well, let's start with, if you could have a superpower, what would that be?
My first thought, which is kind of like the selfish one, right, is I would love to fly. Right. Mm-hmm. But then when I think of like my better self, my higher self, I think I would love to have the superpower where if I could enter any situation or be in any situation and give somebody instant empathy.
Wow. I love that. All right. Adding that to my list of superpowers that I would like to have.
I mean, can you imagine if there were a person like that, like what the world would look like?
You know, it's hard to imagine because we're not close to that, but I would love to live in a world like that.
Not remotely close. Not remotely.
Well, thank you for sharing that, a little insight into who you are. But now let's actually find out who you are and what you do. And how is it that you're in a place to be thinking about trauma and resilience?
I don't even know. So yeah, I'm Dan Griffin. I'm a father. I'm a husband. I'm a man in long-term recovery from addiction, long-term recovery from trauma, long-term recovery from mental health. It just kind of unfolded. I'm very grateful for kind of how life has worked and kind of shown me what it's shown me and taught me what it taught me, but it's been very painful. Mm-hmm. And it's been very arduous. But it started with me being unemployable early in my recovery, and I ended up working at a state psychiatric hospital.
Oh, okay.
And I got fired from a restaurant. I got fired from a restaurant because I told my boss to F off. Because I didn't like what she was doing or saying. And I actually thought the next day when I came back, I'd still have a job. That was my level of entitlement and delusion. So yeah, I got that job and I could connect with the kids there in a way that other staff couldn't. So I knew there was something there. And then I went to graduate school, and it's been a circuitous route in many ways. But, the graduate school came out of undergrad because in undergrad, my senior year, I discovered sobriety, gender, and feminism all at the same time.
Oh, that's a lot.
It's quite an intersection. It's quite an intellectual existential explosion.
Yes.
It was very, very powerful. And this was in 1994.
Okay.
And I was talking to my professor, my instructor, and we were gender studies and feminism. But, the reality is, and this is something, unfortunately, it still is the case. When we say gender studies, what we're mostly meaning is women and females and looking at and the now non-binary kind of gender fluidity, gender diversity. Mm-hmm. But still rarely are there deep explorations of masculinity. And so I didn't have that, but it wasn't a gender class that I took my senior year. It was actually sociology of women. So it makes sense that we weren't focused on men. But I asked my instructor, I said, is anybody looking at this stuff for men? And she said, well, I don't know. Why don't you go find out? And so she had me do some research in the library, and I found a couple of old books and ended up doing a senior thesis on masculinity, and then ended up getting sober, taking a year off. And what was fascinating for me, and that has kind of driven my career, even though in a circuitous sort of way, was my first 12-step meeting that I went to. And I walked into that meeting and I had kind of this awareness of gender in my head. And I walk into the meeting and a man like immediately tried to hug me. And I was like, what are you doing? You know, like, we don't hug. Men don't hug. You know,
Yeah.
Because this is 28, almost 29 years ago.
Okay.
So things have shifted in our society since then. And I live in Los Angeles. And so things have really shifted in certain pockets of our country as far as gender expression or male gender expression. But I went into that meeting, and then like halfway through the meeting, this guy who had walked into the meeting early on, and I looked at him, and he had a white t-shirt. It was grubby. He had a big beer belly, and he had a hat on that said "honk if you love tits." And I just looked at him, and I just was so judgmental and dismissive of him. And halfway through the meeting, this guy is like practically crying, sharing about his fear and what's happening. And I'm like watching this, and I'm thinking, what is happening here?
Yeah.
Who are these men? And that basically started my own parallel sort of process of personal exploration of masculinity and recovery. And then realizing when I got to graduate school, nobody had been studying masculinity and addiction in recovery. And so I wrote the first qualitative thesis in 1998 on that. And then there's been lots of other things along the way that have brought me to this point. Now we're in freaking 2023, which is ridiculous.
Yes, I know. Where does the time go? I don't even know. Well, thank you for sharing that. And you've written a book, haven't you?
I've written several. So my first book was called A Man's Way Through the 12 Steps through Hazelden, which is a big publisher for like addiction recovery literature. And then I co-authored a curriculum with a woman named Dr. Stephanie Covington, who's been like a pioneer in women's addiction and trauma. And it's called, I think I said, Helping Men Recover by Wiley. That got published in 2011, and we just re-released it this last fall. And then when I was interviewing men for my book, A Man's Way Through the 12 Steps, all of them were talking about relationships. And so I looked and I was like, well, has anybody written a book for men in relationships? And there weren't any. And then I proposed to Hazelden, they turned it down. I proposed to 3 other publishers, they turned it down. And then I got a publisher to take it. And it's called A Man's Way Through Relationships, Learning to Love and Be Loved. And my biggest regret about that book, because it's an amazing book, it's so well done. The interviews, I always interview men for my books. And so like the material and the interviews that they give me, the honesty is just so raw and real. My biggest regret is the title. Because I wasn't truly thinking of my audience.
Okay.
Men are not going to buy a book for the most part because of how we're conditioned, not because relationships don't matter to us.
Right.
We're just not going to see a book for the most part that says A Man's Way Through Relationships, Learning to Love and Be Loved, and just go out and buy it, you know?
Yeah.
And then I've got 2 more curricula that we actually just found out are going to be published this fall.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, one for dads. It's the first trauma-informed curriculum for dads called Amazing Dads. And then there's another one tentatively called Healing Men's Pain, and it's specifically for men in trauma.
Wow.
And I've got several other books in the works, but they keep getting turned down. And part of it's because, like it or not, I'm a man writing about men, and it's not necessarily the top item is what I've been hearing from publishers, but there's some other reasons as well. But there's a men in trauma book I'm working on. There's a book that goes along with the Amazing Dads curriculum called Amazing Dads. And then I would love to actually redo the 2 books that I've already done.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, thank you for your work, because like you said, you identified a gap in what people were studying and writing about. And you just mentioned, your book about men and trauma. And what do you think people misunderstand about men and trauma?
Well, I mean, look, there's a social collusion in the silence of men. And I think the biggest thing that we miss is that men have trauma. And I've faced this my whole career when I first started talking about men and trauma, men and women. It was so kind of minimizing. And even some of the best writers, Judith Herman and Judith Jordan and Stephanie Covington herself and others, they see pieces, they've seen pieces of it, right? But Bessel van der Kolk, Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry, there's this blind spot when it comes to men's trauma. So will we talk about veterans trauma? Yes, of course, we'll talk about veterans trauma. But like we have this idea that it has to be maybe extreme in order for men to have trauma, which actually just reinforces that horrible notion of masculinity that says men have to bear pain, like that we just have to grin and bear it. We just have to take pain, that pain is somehow, what transforms us, which ironically, or in actuality, there is some truth to that statement. Pain is transformational, right? But just kind of pathologically denying your pain. And it's not individually, right? We deny men's pain.
Yes.
In the book on men and trauma that I'm working on, I have a chapter, I think it's called, I forget what it's called. I came up with some pretty creative titles for each chapter, but there's a whole section called It's Not Trauma. And that, to me, that's the resounding statement that permeates our denial about men's trauma. And that it's not trauma that happens within men. It happens within women. It happens in our society. It happens in the psychology field. It happens amongst the providers. It happens systemically, socially. I mean, it's everywhere, is the minimization and ignoring of men's pain and trauma.
And why do you think it is that it's so systemic and it's so built into us that we ignore that?
Well, it's part of how we have viewed masculinity, right? There's so many elements to that. One is that when the trauma field first came about, many people don't know this, but when the trauma field first came about, it basically had two forks, right? And one was within the Veterans Administration.
Okay.
And it developed within the Veterans Administration. But the other was at the community level. And then that was being driven by primarily women. And those women were speaking up, understandably, for the first time about what?
About domestic violence and rape?
Domestic violence, sexual abuse, all these horrible, horrible things, right? And who were the primary perpetrators?
Men.
Right.
Yeah.
So who do we not care if they have trauma? Right. So embedded in the development of the modern trauma field is this kind of blind spot, this shadow that says men are perpetrators.
Right.
I think this is the fundamental issue for our society. Right. This is a little saying I have that a lot of people don't like, and I don't really care. That we will never, ever dismantle patriarchy until we deal with the complex reality of male trauma.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is because there's this idea that lurks in the background of a lot of rhetoric that basically says men are this, right? And it tends to be negative.
Yes.
Especially from some feminist lenses, right? I don't know where you're at with feminism, and I don't know where your listeners are at with feminism, but I've earned the right to be able to talk about feminism because I studied it in graduate school because there was no men's studies, and I've stayed connected to it. And I know there's incredible feminists who get it, but there are a lot of feminists who don't. And frankly, I would say the number one reason why many feminists don't get men's pain or the role of masculinity in all of this, or male trauma in all of this, is because they haven't done their own work. The angry kind of, the ones who are stuck in an intellectual sort of deconstruction of what's happening, which there's amazing work in there, and there's amazing insights, and there's amazing commentary, because anger has its place, but people want to read somebody who really gets it. Read Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks gets it. And when she wrote The Will to Change, which is all about men, masculinity, and love, it's a brilliant book. I mean, it's an absolutely brilliant book, but she does not hold back on the role that women and even feminism can play So that's part of it, but there's so many elements, right? So, but we missed men's trauma at the very beginning of the development of the trauma field, and then that's just continued. And so, like, if you read something like The Body Keeps the Score, and if you read it from a gendered lens,
okay,
like if you really paid attention, you'll see that Vanderkolk really has a fixed idea about men and men's trauma and doesn't fully explore the reality or the complexity of the intersection of perpetration or violence and trauma, or the kind of continuum of male trauma. If you read What Happened to You by Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry, you can see similar blind spots, even with Bruce Perry, which kind of blew me away. Where he like totally shines a light on a trauma response from a young kid, a trauma response from a woman. And then he talks about this guy in the airport who's being a total asshole, but says nothing about the fact that that's probably this entitled white guy's trauma response to the flight and what's happening to the flight.
Right.
And I think the thing that's so hard, I certainly have struggled with personally, but I've struggled with professionally, is how do you bring the best measure of compassion for men with trauma, but who also engage in harmful behavior, while at the same time reinforcing like zero tolerance for that behavior.
Right. That's a narrow path to have to navigate.
And until we navigate it, nothing will change.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, truly, because like that to me, that's the thread, that's the crux. God bless the men who have trauma who don't act out. There are many. There are many.
Absolutely.
I'm not one of them. I have harmed many people, and I don't blame my trauma, but my trauma was absolutely connected to my becoming a violent person. Was absolutely connected to me being a controlling guy of patriarchal masculine behavior that is so contradictory to who I am in my heart.
Yeah.
And yet I have done and I have been. And so, it's very personal for me to say these things, and very frustrating as well, because it's like in the trainings I do and the different talks I do, it's just like our society struggles so much to hold the both and.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So there's one group that maybe wants to have compassion for men, but they really don't get how much we need to hold men's feet to the fire for like zero tolerance of any kind of violent or abusive behavior.
Right.
But then there's the much larger group that is basically like, we just have to end men's violence and end men's behavior with no context, no trauma lens, no understanding.
Right. Wow. Thank you. First of all, thank you for the work that you're doing. I myself, who think about trauma as a result of my own trauma, have never looked at it through this lens. And I appreciate that you're looking through some of these resources through a gendered lens and seeing that real absence of attention. And I wanted to ask you, there's a term that gets thrown around a lot. We hear toxic masculinity.
Yeah, I love it.
Tell me what your thoughts about that.
What do you think my thoughts are about that? Look, I created a little infographic many years ago when we first started talking about toxic masculinity. And I knew just when I first heard the term, I hated the term.
Yeah.
And Mark Green is the guy who said he doesn't like it either, but what he talks about is the toxic culture of masculinity. Now that I can get behind. Because it's really the difference of saying there's something wrong with men as opposed to there's something wrong with how we raise men and expect men to be men. Those are two totally different things, right? And if there's something wrong with men, as some of the rhetoric wants to have us believe,
right?
Well, then we're fucked.
Yeah.
Pardon my language, but that's what do you do? Then there is what Obama unfortunately perpetuated when he made some comments. Then there's either the idea of good guys or bad guys.
Yes.
And
yes.
I don't believe that. I don't believe there's good guys or bad guys. I believe there are some bad guys. Like there are some people who will never be reached, and yet I believe those people are probably deeply traumatized. But whatever's happened to them and whatever is going on, like they cannot be reached, and we pray for them and we maybe lock them up because we're also scared of them. But like for me, the little infographic that I created, it showed 4 different types of masculinity, right? And these are the 4 that I've identified. There's toxic masculinity, masculinity. There's traditional masculinity, which kind of just follows male socialization or the man rules, what I, refer to as male socialization. And then there's what's called relaxed masculinity. Now, that's what I discovered in my master's research. And that's what I think is happening in the 12-step community and some of these men's groups out there and a lot of that stuff, where therapy is very much about relaxed masculinity, in that the things you're asked to do to be a part of that process or that culture automatically lessen the impact of the rigidity of masculinity in your performance and in your experience of that. But what I advocate, which is the last one, is conscious masculinity. Okay. And for me, what that is it is understanding that gender is a performance and understanding that every day I have the ability to choose what kind of man I'm going to be. And I don't get to say, well, that's just how men are.
Yeah.
I get to say, what kind of man do I want to be today? And what do I need? What kind of help do I need to be that man? Or looking back on the day, how was I that man and how was I not that man? But consciously thinking about it, right? So conscious masculinity is driven by enlightened choice. But toxic masculinity, and Manya, I don't hear anybody talking about this. And this is, I think, the fundamental flaw in the rhetoric about toxic masculinity. Okay. I think most toxic masculinity, well, let me say it differently, because there's a patriarchal systemic element that, has created a very ugly type of masculinity, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's the abuse of power and control that comes as a result of that. And then there's the systemic abuse of power and control that has hurt so many people, women, people of color, communities of color, all of that stuff. So there's that. There's the systemic, the macro. Mm-hmm. But at the micro level, when you are a human individual, a male identified individual, a lot of that behavior that we would consider toxic and toxic masculinity, I believe, is driven by shame and trauma. And I don't hear us talking about that, because again, if we were to talk about that, then we just couldn't villainize these guys. Then we'd have to have compassion and maybe a little of understanding from them and try to say, like, what are the circumstances that led to this end result before me?
Yes.
Who is saying whatever he's saying. Men are deeply afraid, and we are told our fear has no place. And the only thing that we can do with our fear is turn it to anger.
Yeah. In my work and studies about trauma, we talk about moving from the question of what is wrong with you to the question of what happened to you. And it sounds like we're sort of saying the same thing in terms of men. We're not asking what happened to you. We're just assuming there's something wrong with.
I think that's exactly it. That's our society. I mean, that's our society with people, right? But it's certainly what we're doing with men. And I love that saying. And that's kind of like the big saying of the trauma world, right? Is that shift, is moving from that shift. And the irony is how many people in the field, right? Trauma field, the addiction field, but anybody who espouses the wisdom and the power of trauma, how many people will raise the banner of, oh yeah, it's what happened to you. It's not what's wrong with you. How many of them will then go on and totally ignore that when it comes to men and men's trauma?
Yes. I mean, you're absolutely right. We do have an incredibly large blind spot when it comes to thinking about men's behavior and the underlying causes and the trauma. Wow, you're doing such important work, and you found that gap and you're working to close the gap.
Yeah, I would much rather be drawing cartoons or working in marketing. This is not easy. It's painful. It has forced me to look at the ugliest parts of myself. Mm-hmm. I was out there, my career started taking off really in a big way in 2014. And at that time, I was still struggling with my own harming behavior and interpersonal relationships. And it's very fascinating to me as I look back, because it all came to a head basically in 2017 or 2018. And I had so much shame about it. I mean, so much shame about it. I stopped kind of basically doing this work because I just felt like I had failed. all that imposter syndrome that had been kind of floating around in the background, all of that just took over.
Yeah.
And I was crushed. Here's another thing, right? And I mentioned this in the interview or the thing for the podcast, but are you familiar with the parable of the blind men and the elephant?
Yes.
Okay. So you're familiar, but your listeners, maybe not all of them are, right?
Yes.
So in this parable, these 8 blind men are brought to an elephant, but they don't know it's an elephant. They're just brought to this place, and then they put their hand on a certain part of the elephant. And the blind men, like the blind man touching the trunk of the elephant is like, oh, I know what this is. This is a big snake, right? And then there's a blind man with his hand on the tail. And it's like, I know what this is. This is a rope. And then there's a man who's like right up against the the body of the torso of the elephant. And he's like, I know what this is. This is a wall. And it continues. And every single one of them is convinced, because they're only touching one part of the elephant, they're convinced they know exactly what it is, and they start to fight. And there's 2 ways that the parable goes. In one of the ways, it just completely degrades into chaos and conflict, and they kill each other or something like that. But in the other one, they start talking to each other.
Yes.
And they figure out, oh, we all are touching an elephant.
Yes.
Well, that to me is where we are today, right?
Okay.
So I got sober. I'm in the addiction world, and we've got our hand on one part of the elephant. We're like, oh, it's addiction. It's addiction that's causing all the issues, right? And then suddenly people started paying attention to mental health. But, you have NAMI and you have the whole mental health thing, and the mental health world was like, oh, no, it's mental health. It's mental health. Mental health drives addiction. Then right when I came on the scene in my career, because I worked in treatment courts.
Oh, yeah.
For almost 10 years in Minnesota before I left. I wrote my book and left. So it was like 2009, right? And that's when trauma was starting to kind of come into some of its own, right? I mean, you'd had these people who had been talking about it for years, like Vanderkolk and John Briere and Judith Herman and all this stuff. But now it's starting to get a voice. And then suddenly, with Gabor Mate especially, right, now you have these people who have their hand on the elephant.
Yes.
And they've got hands all over the elephant, but they're like, oh, it's a wall, right?
Yeah.
So in the world of trauma, everybody thinks trauma's the thing, right? So now, you deal with your trauma, you heal addiction. Wrong. Okay, I just want to go out and say, I don't care who's saying it. I live in the midst of addiction and recovery. I don't just study it.
Yeah.
I don't just visit it. I live in it. And I can promise you, there are people who have done trauma work who have relapsed and they're still alcoholic and they die. Yeah. And there are people who have had the idea that, oh, I've done all my trauma work now. I don't need any support for my addiction, any of that, right? So that infuriates me, this message. I literally was at a conference with one of the top EMDR specialists in the world. In the world. And he made a statement. And I was like, did he say what I just thought he said? This is years ago. So in front of the whole room, I wanted to get him on record. I said, wait, so did you just say if a person does enough EMDR around their addiction, they could go back to safely drinking?
Oh.
And he said, yes.
Wow.
So that is what we're still dealing with when it comes to the hands on the elephant.
Right.
Let's not even talk about the amount of addiction that still permeates the trauma field and all of the trauma awareness, whether it's sex addiction or the alcohol and other drugs. So I bring that up, and it's kind of a long soapbox, one of my many soapboxes today.
Let me ask you a question. I mean, I like that parable of the elephant. I think and I like how you explain it, how we're all coming from different perspectives and we're not maybe seeing the big picture. But what do you think is the most important action or policy we can take to solve this issue? Get it right.
The thing is, for whatever reason, we're always looking for the one thing.
Yeah, I know.
We're always looking for and in our society, we really, really want the one thing that's going to take care of addiction that doesn't have anything to do with like spirituality or the 12 steps or like there's this love-hate relationship to the 12-step community. It's like we're constantly coming back to it as a long-standing, very successful program, but it's a deeply human program. I mean, it's a very traumatized community.
Yeah.
And so, but the language and the wisdom of trauma is now starting to seep into the 12-step community. And it's amazing and it's beautiful. And I'm watching it happen here in Los Angeles. And it feels integrated to me.
Yeah.
But the reason I brought that up, the whole hands on the elephant thing, is because of what it taught me. So here I am, I'm in my career. I've been on medication for bipolar for some time. I never really accepted it. I just took the medication. Okay. It wasn't to just keep anybody quiet, but it was just kind of like, it was half in, half out, right?
Yeah.
Fully have accepted my alcoholism and addiction. So I'm doing that. Then I discovered trauma and trauma work, and I'm listening to the rhetoric. And it's seeping in. And there's a part of me that's like, you know what? I don't think I have a mental health issue.
Yeah.
I think it's trauma. I think it's all trauma. And so I'm going to stay in my 12-step community, and I'm going to do all this trauma work, and I'm not going to be paying attention to my mental health as much. And I'm here to say, for those of your listeners or anybody else who might hear this, I don't understand. I don't think anybody really understands. But what I will say is I've done a shit ton of trauma work. It didn't heal my bipolar.
Okay.
So those out there who are saying, oh, yeah, well, bipolar is just a reflection of trauma and traumatic responses and the brain dysregulation and all, they have all these ideas about what bipolar is. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. But
how much work do I have to do? Right. Before your little theory is correct. And at what expense? Right. My marriage, my relationship with my daughter, my job, my career.
Yeah.
So that's been the toughest thing for me, is been like, damn, okay, so I got my recovery for addiction, and that feels good. Now I feel grounded in my bipolar because the medication had just gotten really off, and I didn't even know it. And I thought some of the dysregulation I was having was actually me working through the trauma and me getting processing and then continued trauma work. So, what's the answer? Well, the answer is when somebody says, this is the thing, to not listen to them.
Oh, yes. I like that.
Because there is no thing. I mean, Gabor Mate, I have a lot of respect for him, but I think he's dangerous in some ways because of his rhetoric around addiction.
Yeah.
And I think there are still in the 12-step community so many people who they don't have a clue about trauma.
Yeah.
So what's the solution? The solution is all the blind men have to talk to each other and stop thinking that they have the answer.
Yes. I think you're right in that we very much want to find the answer, the pill, the one step. If all I just have to do is that, and then everything will be fine. And it is work to talk to each other and to be open that I might not necessarily know the answer.
Oh, and to complicate it even more, how about the fact that, because I'm sure some of your listeners are maybe thinking about this, how about the fact that because we have a society that isn't trauma informed and we have medical providers who are not trauma informed, and because our first step is to medicate people, is that we are medicating a lot of trauma that's not getting dealt with. And we are looking at trauma responses and symptomology that is not mental health, but is actually trauma and trauma responses, or we're at least looking at a complex comorbidity that we're not really recognizing at all. And so we're just medicating it. And so then you get people, I've seen some things on Instagram where people are just like anti-med. And I get that. I get why they would be anti-medication because of how it's been used.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. I can see that as well. Wow, Dan, this has been an amazing conversation, and it's about to be over much too soon. I definitely want to talk with you more about some of these things. A final question for you, though. What would you tell your 18-year-old self about trauma or compassion or resiliency?
I have been thinking about this question since you first gave it to me, and I don't have a clear answer. When I think of myself and I was 18, I was so lost and I was so alone, and I felt like there was no way I could ever talk about that. And so I think maybe one of the best messages I could give that 18-year-old part of myself is it's okay not to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not alone. And whether you ever share it, I believe that there's something inside of you that someone else desperately wants to hear and to help you heal from.
Wow. That's really beautiful, Dan. Thank you for sharing that. On that note, we are going to have to end, but can you tell our listeners how can they reach you, Dan?
I don't want anybody reaching. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. Only reach me if you have nice things to say. No, I'm very happy to engage about anything I've talked about. Totally open to agreement, disagreement, to whatever questions. They can reach me at dan@dangriffin.com. That's my email address. I try to be pretty responsive. And then they can learn more about me at my website, www.dangriffin.com.
Excellent. Well, we will put links to those in the show notes as well. Dan, thank you so much. I've learned a lot in our conversation, and I think our listeners are going to as well.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. I hope you got as much out of this conversation as I did. So if you'd like to learn more about me, Manya Chilinsky, I work with organizations to help understand how to create environments where people can thrive after difficult life experiences. And I do this through talks and consulting. I'm a survivor of mass violence, and I use my experience to help leaders learn about resiliency, compassion, and trauma-sensitive leadership, to build strategies to enable teams to thrive and be engaged amidst difficulty and turmoil. If this is something you want to learn more about, visit my website, www.manyachilinsky.com, or email me at manya@manyachilinsky, or stop by my social media on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks so much.